Tonight on Insights on PBS Hawaii, warmer temperatures, rising sea levels, and less rainfall. Just a few effects of climate change scientists say we're starting to experience in Hawaii and across the Pacific. What can we expect in years to come? And how do we translate research into action to combat and adapt to climate change? We'll ask scientists, conservationists, and policy experts. Now, live in our studio, our host, Dan Boylan.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. In his State of the Union address this week, President Obama promised to make climate change a priority. In Hawaii's recent State of the State, Governor Abercrombie emphasized the urgency of pursuing renewable energy and preserving our forest watershed, both part of the state's climate change plan. And last month in Fiji, experts from across the Pacific region gathered to review the latest research and its impact on island communities. Everyone is talking about climate change, but though the science is convincing, the best course of action remains unclear. Experts say we need two plans to protect our natural resources for future generations. One to reduce greenhouse gases warming the planet, and another to help us survive the impending changes. Tonight we'll talk with experts on both the research and strategy sides, all working towards solutions in Hawaii, the Pacific, and globally. This can be a tough issue for us non-scientific types. Certainly I qualify as one of those. So we hope you will contribute your questions tonight. What do you want to know about the cause and effects of climate change? Do you believe it's an urgent threat? How do you think we should address it? Please join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments for our guests. The contact information you now see on your screen will be repeated throughout the program. And remember, Insights is also streaming live on your computer and will be posted on our website following the broadcast. Now let's meet our guests. William Aila Jr. chairs the State Department of Land and Natural Resources. Before Governor Abercrombie elevated him to the top job, Bill worked for 24 years in the DLNR as the small boat harbor master for Waianae, the community in which he grew up. He has a degree in tropical agriculture from the University of Hawaii. Bill has served as a member of boards and commissions serving the Waianae coast and conserving Hawaii's marine resources. Chip Fletcher is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Geology and Geophysics in the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and that exhausted me, Chip. He is a recognized expert on sea level rise and has received an Environmental Achievement Award in climate change science from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for that work. He has with him tonight his third book on climate change. Stanton Enomoto works for the National Park Service and is currently on assignment with the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, where he serves as Cultural Adaptation Coordinator. Pixie, I think you guys should wear little wings, is a coalition of government, private, and nonprofit organizations working on strategies to address climate change. Victoria Keener is a research fellow at the East-West Center and program manager of the Pacific Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. She is the lead editor of the recent Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment, which will be part of the National Climate Assessment Report to Congress. Victoria has a PhD in agricultural and biological engineering, specializing in research into climate variability and El Nino. And I deserve a PhD in saying assessment that many times. Victoria, you went to the Climate Forum in Fiji. What was that about and what came out of it, and how is the Pacific unique in any way in this global warming a problem that the whole world faces?
We were at the Pacific Islands Climate Services Forum in Suva, Fiji, and it was a joint effort from the Pacific Climate Information Services, PACSIS, headed up by John Mara, who was on the last climate change show, and NOAA, and then the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji. So it was a joint partnership, not only looking at Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, the U.S. affiliated islands, but also beyond, going much more internationally. So from New Zealand and PNG and all the way down to Samoa and American Samoa, the Cook Islands. And it was really looking at not only what are people already doing in terms of climate adaptation on a country level, what other initiatives are going on internationally from big science organizations, from aid organizations, what kind of information do people need, what do they already have, and it also offered a variety of trainings on how to use existing climate information. So for example, stream flow forecasts or storm trackers or things like that. In terms of what makes the Pacific Islands unique in terms of climate change, there's a lot going on in the region. And it's easy to say that because there really aren't as many people here as other places in the world, there's not that much land area, that it feels marginalized. But really there are so many good adaptation and mitigation efforts going on in the islands. And really, we're going to be feeling a lot of the impacts of climate change first. So it's great that we're kind of on the forefront of getting things done in relation to dealing with it.
And some of the other islands in the South Pacific are under greater threat than we are, aren't they? I mean, places like Kiribati could disappear from the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the low-lying islands, the atoll nations, a lot of the Marshall Islands, you hear the country Tuvalu thrown around a lot in terms of a very low-lying island that's under a lot of risk in terms of sea level effects and declining freshwater resources and growing populations. And so, yeah, those are at a much greater threat than in terms of the high islands and the resources that we have.
I know, Bill, that people in your position are all trying to get something into the state of address, and climate change got into it. And I'm just wondering, as part of DLNR, what part of your job deals specifically with climate change, and what is DLNR particularly interested in seeing brought forward?
Okay, well, the governor is very much interested in climate change and how it's going to impact things like energy, things like agriculture, things like our forests. So when it's beyond DLNR, and the governor has actually asked department heads to work together. So the Department of Agriculture with Russell Kokuban, myself, the DBED, Richard Lim, we've all been working together on projects. Specifically with DLNR, the governor has supported, this is now the second year in the legislature, the Rainfall is the Forest Initiative, which seeks to double the amount of priority watersheds that we protect. Mainly through fencing and reforestation projects, primarily, and then secondarily going back in and dealing with invasive species. The thought process there is if we can protect the sponge, if you will, our best quality sponges across the state, we have a much better chance of preserving and ensuring potable drinking water sources, reducing the amount of sediment runoff to our coral reefs. Also, in working with the Department of Agriculture, working on getting private landowners as well as all the government dams and reservoirs in shape so that they can deal with the increased heavy rainfall that we expect from all the climate rainfall models. So it's multi-pronged, and it goes all the way from the top of the mountain to making sure that we keep as much sedimentation off the reefs as possible.
And when you talk about the sponges, you're talking about the watersheds, you're talking about the forested areas?
We're talking about the forested areas, and generally our definition of a priority watershed is something that receives 40 inches or more of rainfall a year.
How immediate is the threat to Hawaii in your mind to global warming? We've said that low-lying atolls are in trouble, but we'll just move up to Pacific Palisades and Pearl City, up there on the hill.
That'd be fine if you have some drinking water with you. I mean, basically, the problems associated with climate change in Hawaii boil down to a 6% decrease in rainfall over the last 30 years, and that varies from 4% to as much as 9% on Maui. Increased air temperature, just the increased air temperature and heat waves that will happen with increasing frequency towards the end of the summer and early fall. Those have public health issues, those have energy issues. People are going to rely more and more on air conditioning. Is our grid and our energy sources ready to deal with the increase in air conditioning, the drawdown on the power? Several people, several experts in this area have told me that We used to shut off our air conditioning in the evening and just enjoy the trade winds, but people are now finding that that's not comfortable enough, and air conditioning now is cranking through all night long. Sea level rise is a problem that is affecting all the islands. The oceans are warming, and they're soaking up a lot of the CO2 that we're dumping into the atmosphere, which is causing them to acidify. And that affects our coral reefs, and it affects the plankton portion of the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem that forms the basis of the food chain. Storms are more intense. When it rains, it's likely that that rainfall will be, greater chance of it being a record breaker. So we get intense rainfall, even in an overall regime of less rain specifically. And when you get an intense short rainfall, most of it just runs off into the ocean and doesn't actually feed our aquifers.
I read an article also about, you're talking about the aquifer, and I believe that you're changing some of your views about what the water rising, whether it's seawater or whether it's actually fresh water coming up out of the aquifers.
Well,
do I have that?
Let's define an aquifer as a body of groundwater that we use, fresh water that we use. Most of the aquifers that we know of in Hawaii are actually not threatened by sea level rise. Some of the aquifers are experiencing salinization, but that's because we're drawing water out of them too fast and we're actually sucking up the salt water beneath them. What you may have heard about is that along our coastal plains, as sea level rises, the groundwater that's underneath our streets and our homes is also going to rise. In fact, with 2 feet of sea level rise, 70% of the flooding in the Honolulu area will be due to the water table rising, not due to waves coming up over the beach, not due to marine inundation.
So that's relatively new, right? I mean, that's a recognition of that.
That's a bit of research that we've been working on, but we just got a paper published in Nature Climate Change, and there was a newspaper article on that about a month ago. And so it's a recognition that sea level rise involves more than just coastal erosion and more than just marine inundation. In fact, the groundwater table goes up and down with the tides. And many of the viewers may know of, at high tide, salt water comes up out of our storm drain system and forms little puddles around the manhole covers and the grates on the edges of the streets in Kakaako and Waikiki. That's salt water, that's sea level rise coming into our lives.
Stanton, I did not mean to make fun of Pixie, but actually it's kind of fun to make fun of Pixie. I'm sorry, but what is the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative? What does it do and who's involved?
Okay, well, it actually involves a lot of what was just being discussed. The Pixie is a cooperative of about 30 federal, state, non-governmental organizations that come together around not only natural resource conservation issues, but also looking at the human dimension, the cultural resource impacts as well. We look at it from a very integrated approach. We kind of look at things from what we call a biocultural perspective, that it's not just thinking about our watersheds, but thinking about the cultural sites, the cultural uses of those watersheds in an ahupua'a context perhaps, or thinking about our reefs and the impacts that Chip described about acidification and other things, not just seeing it from the fish's perspective, but seeing it from a cultural use perspective. What does that mean for all of our shoreline fishers, our subsistence gatherers in the uplands, our kalo farmers on the windward coast? So we're trying to look at it from an integrated perspective that not only takes into consideration the impacts to our natural resources, but the human systems that access them and will be relying on them in the future.
I've got to ask a question that bothers me all the time, and it's this, from a political point of view, it's very, very hard to do anything big anymore, anything big. How does anything get any bigger than fighting something that most people can't see or are unaware of, or is so minimal, unless Chip scares them to death with his map, to get anything to happen? How do you get around that? I mean, how do you make people get their heads around it?
I think you're hitting it right on the head. It's a challenging problem across many sectors. And when we think about the impacts of climate change and the time frame on which those impacts will occur, it's not as though sea level is going to jump up 3 feet overnight and flood Waikiki or what have you. these changes are going to occur over a long decades period of time, where many of us may not even be alive when Waikiki floods, let's say. So it's how do we engage in a conversation about impacts that are going to exist beyond our lifetime and impact my kids' generation, my grandkids' generation. And at least from my perspective, it comes back to some of the values, some of the ethics, and some of the legacies, if you will, that we want to instill in future generations so that they're best able to be prepared and that they understand some strategies in which they can adapt to those changes as it happens. So it's, at least at a social level or at a community or family level, I think it comes back to connecting to our environment in ways that perhaps we haven't. I think about my mom and my parents' generation. You know, they grew up in plantation camps on Maui where they had to live off the land. Nowadays, most people think 7-Eleven or Safeway or
That's
Costco.
That's the land.
Yeah, that's their breadbasket. So it's maybe at least at a human level returning back to some of that stuff, getting connected. At a policy level, we really need to engage more. I think we have the pieces in place, the PERCA findings that Victoria talked about. Last year, the legislature passed and the governor enacted a climate change adaptation policy that spreads across not only the state but down to the county level into our planning documents. We need to kind of beef up that dialogue and really start, taking it to the next step.
You know, there are no regrets steps that we can take. For instance, the Watersheds Initiative, it makes sense whether or not there's climate change happening. It just makes sense to preserve our watersheds and to fence out ungulates and to take out the invasive species. It makes sense that when you build a house in the coastal zone, you raise it up on footings so that a tsunami or hurricane storm surge is not going to destroy the house. It makes sense to protect our storm drain system and our coastal highways that are getting attacked by high waves or coastal erosion. So there are no regret steps that can be taken right now that would, just on an increment by increment level, would go a long way towards adapting to the problems.
But the real problems with, you're very worried about the supply of water, if I'm not mistaken. And particularly, we've been in a drought stage now in Hawaii for quite a while, right?
Yeah, I was just looking earlier at the Drought Impacts Reporter, which is online and everyone can go look at if you Google Hawaii Drought Impacts Reporter. But 3 months ago, actually, 100% of the state of Hawaii was in drought, which is kind of a very striking statistic to think about. I wouldn't say, we're so worried about water supply at this moment, but we, in our research, we are concerned about looking into the future, into those sources of water. What is the changing climate going to do to those patterns? We're already seeing decreased rainfall and a long-term trend across the state of Hawaii, and we're already seeing that affect our ecosystems, especially at the highest levels, highest elevations on the mountains where it's warming the fastest. So there are really a lot of issues, and water is a cross-cutting issue that goes across all different sectors.
Do people in Maui and in the Big Island, I mean, who have dealt with this, do they feel this a greater sense of something big is happening?
I think certainly portions of the communities that are impacted right now are feeling that. You have communities on Maui right now that are applying to the state for beach replenishment projects. You have homeowners that are asking for assistance on what can we do. The shoreline in front of my house is going away. The tree that I grew up in is about to fall into the ocean. We also need to get to other users to make them understand that the parents of children at these parks that are on or near the beach, the grass is going to die in 10 to 20 years. We're not going to be able to keep grass alive there because of the saltwater intrusion. So we should start moving parks or building new parks away from the ocean. These are all the things that we need to do, making people understand that this is going to have a real impact on my children's experience. If we don't build parks away from the ocean, where are all the kids going to go play soccer and play football?
Well, what if a guy's got a $5 million house on the beach in Lanikai, and he says, and you say to him, we have a policy, you can't build seawalls, right?
Right.
And he says to you going to compensate me when this thing goes out to sea?
Well, it's right now, if you purchase property at the shoreline, you have to do it understanding that this is a consequence that's coming. I'll give you one that's even better than that. You built a seawall 20 years ago and it was legal. Sea level rise or subsidence now puts the seawall in submerged lands. Well, your seawall is now on our property, which used to be your property. As the Department of Land and Natural Resources representative, we're going to issue you a citation for your wall encroaching upon what is now our property, and I have to charge you market value rates for that seawall. We have a bill before the legislature, hopefully, that will correct that right now. But these are the serious consequences to property owners and to government regulators that we face today, which is going to increase exponentially in the future.
Property owners must not like to see you coming. Governor Abercrombie wants to build Oahu's third city in Kakaako. Should the Hawaii Community Redevelopment Authority, HCDA, be worried about rising sea levels there? And if so, what should they be doing in 2013 since everything is still in the drawing board stage? Michael in downtown.
Yes, they should be worried about the effects of sea level rise. And we know an awful lot right now about what the potential effects of sea level rise will be. We understand that a global target, and Hawaii is included in this, of 1 foot of sea level rise by mid-century, and a global target of about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. We can map the potential effects related to this amount of sea level rise, and we can then start talking about how are we going to adapt to this and what's our reaction going to be to these problems, because there's a whole spectrum of ways that we can react to the problem.
Yeah, throughout some of the stuff I've read about the work that you and others have done, I see the phrase computer modeling of the future. And I found myself going as a cynic, come on, computer modeling. How do you model and come up and say 3 feet?
This is not based on modeling. Satellites have been measuring Greenland and Antarctica for 20 years. And if you take the rate of ice loss on those two ice sheets, and you take the amount of thermal expansion of seawater due to it absorbing heat, you do the simple addition and you get 1 foot of sea level rise 40 years from now, 37 years from now. So unless something amazing happens to stop the melting of the glaciers and to stop the heating of the planet, this is going to happen. We may as well start talking about it and figure out how we're going to adapt to it.
Victoria, you'll be young enough to maybe be around in 2050 or beyond. Would you buy a condo in Kakaako, a new condo on, say, the 3rd floor?
I probably wouldn't be able to afford it. So.
Well, let's leave that aside. Let's say you could, because a lot of people might think that it's not going to be worth anything because it's going to float away.
I mean, that's a hard question that depends on a lot of issues other than sea level rise and climate change. It would depend. It would depend. Yeah. But I mean, in terms of what's going on in 2050, I think that a lot of people think about changing climate as being something that's so far away that it's not going to affect them. But we have these, as you say, these computer models that are based on what we're already seeing the climate do in Hawaii, all these changes, and we see that if I had a child today, by the time it was my age, around 2050. They would, the coral reefs would already be expected to bleach every year around here, and they're big impacts.
I don't quite understand that. You probably do from a cultural point of view, certainly, the concern about the reefs. What's wrong with a dead reef? I mean, there are dead reefs all over the place. There are a lot of dead reefs in Hawaii, right, already. I mean, why should we worry about that so much?
Well, the reefs, there's a number of ways you can look at it. From a cultural perspective, the coral polyp is one of the early starters in Hawaiian genealogy. Things come from the reef. Without the coral polyp, we don't have the marine invertebrates that access them. We don't have the fish species that we rely upon for our livelihood, for our lives. So everything comes back to the reef. So as these things, as Victoria said, start to bleach out every year or on an annual basis, the time it would take for them to recover before the next bleaching cycle would happen is too close. So we start dying off. These reefs may start dying off. And then all the fish species that are attached to them start going away or migrating to other places as well. So for those people that rely upon the reefs for their livelihood and cultural traditions, they're going to be impacted.
And biologically and chemically, I mean, the coral reefs, the polyps, take a lot of the CO2 and convert them, and take them basically out of the process that causes additional heating. So we need those coral reefs to be around as long as we can, as well as all the phytoplankton.
And something like 25% of open ocean marine species spend some part of their life near coral reefs, so the ramifications would ripple out through the entire ocean.
Aaron says, how can there be global warming when we just had a huge snowstorm on the mainland? There's no global warming.
As the air warms, it holds more moisture, and so you get more intense rainfalls and you get more intense snowstorms. Also, the Arctic is warming, which makes the jet stream create big meanders. And when one of these big jet stream meanders comes down to the United States, it brings Arctic air down with it. With more moisture in the air, you get Snowmageddon, which happened a couple years ago. Snowmageddon. It hit Washington, D.C., I think 4 years ago, and all discussion of climate change ground to a halt.
Yeah, government ground to a halt.
Yeah, government ground to a halt.
Snowmageddon. I like that a lot.
So as ironic as it seems, an intense snowfall actually can be tied to climate change.
You've said the same thing is true with rainstorms, for example. We got very heavy rainstorms often, but drought all around them.
Yep. In terms of the energy, I mean, we have more heat, more energy trapped in our global system. So we're getting more energetic events, whether it's storms, snowstorms, heat waves, waves in general.
Okay, so this thing's going to happen. And guys like you in politics and guys like you on committees with wings are going to explain to everybody why they should do it. And you're going to try to scare folks, and maybe that'll do it. But the question is, what do we do? I mean, one, how do we adapt? Some of this stuff we're not going to be able to stop, right? So that's adaptation. And then the other one is mitigation. So how do we mitigate? How do we stop more of it from happening? And what should we do now? Do we need to do now? Anybody want to start with that?
Well, one thing that we try and do in our research is really bridge that gap between scientific, technical knowledge and really getting it out at an agency level, a policy level. So making translation of that scientific information to make it more directly applicable. So both integrated research efforts and outreach efforts that really help policymakers make informed decisions when they're going forward and how they want to lead the state and the counties.
There are also unpredictable elements. For instance, this past year, the United States production of CO2 dropped back to 1992 levels. And it's because we've started drilling in new ways using hydraulic fracturing of shale beds and extracting methane. And on the East Coast, well, throughout the mainland where you need to heat a house or a building, it's not too hard to switch from an oil-based heating system to a methane-based heating system. When you burn oil or coal, you produce CO2, which goes up into the atmosphere and can last for over 1,000 years. When you burn methane, methane goes up into the atmosphere, and it usually only has about a 10-year turnaround time, and it can come back out that quickly. So this wasn't predicted several years ago, and now the United States has decreased its greenhouse gas production.
Yeah, hybrid cars and as well, and
right. Increasing the mileage. President Obama in his State of the Union address called for getting our transportation system, or at least our cars, off of oil-dependent system completely, and going into removing the sort of tyranny of the gasoline prices that constantly affect all of our budgets, and just getting away from oil in our cars.
But economic recession has to have contributed to this too.
Yes, and also we had a warm winter. So, I mean, these are sort of the unknowns that could have been forecast, but everybody was completely surprised when we found out our CO2 emissions were down to 1992 levels.
But I still want to go back. How do we adapt? How do we adapt? How do we, or how do we mitigate?
Well, adaptation and mitigation, sometimes they can be confusing concepts, but sometimes the science can be overwhelming for some of our viewers. But I think it comes back to some of the things I touched on earlier. Really, it comes down to the personal choices that we make. and those choices are guided by the values that we hold, or the ethics that we have, et cetera. They influence the decisions that we take. So, in simple terms, we understand that some of the largest carbon emitters industries come out of either the energy field or automobiles. And maybe if we recognize that and realize that it can impact our global climate system and we want to take steps, maybe it's not driving, maybe it's catching a bus, maybe it's teleworking. It doesn't, some of these measures don't have to cost, they could actually save us some, individually save us some money. Instead of going out to the store and spending on imported food, maybe it's planting a garden in our yards. Little things, I think, little steps that people can take that can have a big impact and create greater awareness and maybe start to change some of our thinking, some of our values, some of our ethics that we then pass on to our kids that they then are better prepared to adapt.
Yeah, so my focus and the governor's focus is around the issue of water. So if we protect the watersheds, if we go into sort of revitalization mode of all of these dams and reservoirs that many are over 100 years old in the state of Hawaii, and get them in shape so that they can absorb these heavy, intensive rains that will be coming, and store water and allow for groundwater percolation and keep sedimentation off the reefs. If we can do that, then we'll have water supplies for agriculture, we'll have water supplies for drinking, we'll have water supplies for all of our needs. But we have to, it all starts at the top of the mountain with our priority watersheds. We have to start there. So,
I read that in places like Nanakuli and in Mapunapuna, new drainage systems have been used to try to adapt to the problems of rising water. But are there ultimately those kinds of things are not going to be enough, right? I mean, those you can't. New drainage systems would be overwhelmed, wouldn't they?
It's a matter of timing. So I think adaptation can happen, over a time scale of a day, a month, a year, a decade, 50 years, 100 years. And I think there are things we can do over all these different time scales. So what they've done in Mapunapuna is they've put boots on the end of the storm drain system so that at high tide, the salt water has trouble coming up onto the streets. And now there are blocks of Mapunapuna that once again can be useful, and the businesses are doing much better because they're not flooded out by seawater every day. But this effect will have maybe a 20, 30, 40 year, 50 year benefit to it when sea level rises towards the end of the century, and perhaps it's 3 feet, perhaps it's as much as 6 feet. Mapunapuna becomes a new arm of Kehi Lagoon, which is what it used to be before we filled it. So if we can get a couple of generations of additional use out of a piece of land, I think that's a very strong adaptation step that's been taken.
What does the panel think of the United States efforts compared with Asian country efforts to combat climate change? How are we doing compared to, you met some of those folks over there, didn't you, at that conference?
Well, from Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
So from an adaptation level, realistically speaking, a lot of the smaller Pacific Islands don't have that much to mitigate to start with. At the same time, some of them are very advanced in terms of what they're trying to do to mitigate their emissions, but at the same time, they are very involved in the UN framework on climate change. They are part of the Alliance of Small Island States in the UN and their representation. They're doing a lot of adaptation activities that are frankly a lot ahead of what we're doing in the United States.
I'm kind of interested in politics, and one of the things I was looking at a thing the other day where a candidate for president who did not win, but he got 48% of the vote, and in his convention speech, he just literally scoffed at the idea that the incumbent president would think he could change the atmosphere and heal the earth. He just made fun of it. That man got 48% of the vote. And I'm sure there's somebody watching us, maybe not, they may not be the PBS demographic, but there may be somebody watching us. Look at those academics up there. Look at those folks talking about climate change and all this nonsense, all this stupid stuff, trying to change the world. Tell us about all this stuff's going to take place in the future. What do you say to them?
What do you say to them? This more grantsmanship by academics or you know, guy working for a crazy academic who's governor? I'm kidding.
Well, if he's in Hawaii, I say get in your car and drive around and take a look at the beaches and take a look at the erosion that's happening. Take a look at the mountains that are brown more times of the year. Take a look at the increased number of brush fires that we have. These are all the signs. They're right here in front of us.
There are a few websites out there that specialize in knocking down the latest climate science. And it actually is easy to build an argument against something that someone has just published that says climate change is real. It's not hard to pick at the statistics or to say, oh, what you're saying only applies for a small part of the world, or I have another data set which refutes what you've said. And some of the websites out there that do this have a huge audience, but they're getting their information from one source, and they're not seeking information from other sources. If you lead a fact-based life, if your decision-making is based on facts, then you owe it to yourself and the people around you and the community you live in to seek out all the best information. And the published peer-reviewed literature on climate change is enormous. It's enormous. And we should really stop referring to climate change as happening in the future, because it's happening right now in very meaningful ways.
Has anyone done a study on the sustainability of our water with all of the tourist usage? What are the alternatives? Has that kind of study been done?
If you were to ask the City and County of Honolulu Board of Water Supply right now, they would say that at the current rates that we're using water, including the 7 million tourists that come here per year, it's sustainable at that rate. Looking forward, we have to take steps to conserve water. We have to take steps because we know that rainfall is going to be less. So we have to start instituting processes now to account for that, or we will not be able to handle the 7 million tourists in addition to the residents that live here.
Yeah, almost 8 million this year. Sure. Almost 8 million. What are people doing to mitigate against the climate change effects on developments along Hawaii's coastline? And this person's again talking about Kakaako Development. Is there anything? I mean, I've seen big stories on that. That thing's going to be huge. I mean, you should go talk to that boss of yours. He's big behind that. Do you think that's a good place to put it?
Well, it's one of the few places that I think all of the ingredients are in place to put workforce housing because of the uniqueness of the land, the tax incentives that are here right now. So perhaps we should take a look at not putting anything on the first or second floor. I mean, people live in buildings that are surrounded by water. It's a place called Venice. So that's part of adaptation.
Do you think this is a good idea to build?
Again, I go back to your time scale. I think that you can invest and have several generations of people, 2 or 3 generations, that live in an area before it becomes unlivable, especially if you build certain safeguards into the way that you develop a property. And if you have an intensely used urban area, you can actually pump down the water table and probably buy many years of additional usage. They pump salt water out of the New York subway system because it's an economic decision. And a lot of this comes down to being an economic decision.
Given our limited ability to factor in complex wind patterns, will we ever have a definitive answer to the global warming question? If not, then what should we believe, Forrest says. You understand that question?
Not entirely.
I don't.
There's a definitive answer right now. Global warming is real. The tropics are expanding. The global winds have accelerated because the evaporation and the air circulation, the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, all of these have spun up because evaporation has spun up with the warmer air. So I'm not sure what he's getting at with the winds, but the winds have responded to warming in a way that science would have predicted.
We had a whole show on this one time. How do underwater volcano eruptions affect the temperature of the water and the climate? And what about VOG? What effect does that have on the climate? Any idea? Any thoughts?
In general, more particulates in the air from volcanic explosions actually serve a cooling effect in the atmosphere. So historically, when you look at millions of years of records of temperature data, after a large volcanic eruption event, you get global cooling, which is visible in that long-term record.
When scientists say that they do not have conclusive evidence of man-made global warming, does that mean that they have no proof of global warming?
Scientists.
Yeah, I'll punt to the scientists.
I don't know where he got that statement, but every scientist I know sees that there is the strong preponderance of evidence points to human production of greenhouse gases as causing global warming, and global warming is proven to exist. You can look at hundreds of different responses to global warming that you would expect to happen. Ecosystems are moving up to higher elevations to find cooler temperatures. The tundra, the line of permanently frozen ground in Canada, is migrating to the north. The boreal forest is migrating onto open tundra. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I've got a whole list. I could read 40 different proven, observation-based, not computer-based, not model-based, but observation-based ecosystem reactions to a warmer climate.
And part of the strength of the Pacific Regional Climate Assessment that we just released is that it doesn't rely all on projections. It's observed data. These are things that we're seeing across the islands, not just Hawaii, but the other Pacific islands as well. Observed changes that we're seeing, trends over the last 100 years.
Stanton, I've got to believe that some Hawaiian folks have got to be saying, we could have told you so. Do you get some of that in your discussions with intercultural responses?
Sure. Yes, I have heard that comment from a number of people, and also around this idea of adaptation. Hawaiians lived in close relations to the environment, so adaptation was part and parcel of their life. You know, they managed the resources. As the resources changed as a result of a storm event or a flooding event, they moved on or rebuilt their walls, fish pond walls, or their kalolo'i or what have you. So it's, in some senses, there's traditional knowledge that can help us through some adaptation actions. But some of the challenges that I think the Hawaiian community will face looking forward as some of these larger impacts start to happen, whether it's more storminess, sea level rise, a lot of the sites and places that Native Hawaiians hold sacred, or not just Native Hawaiians, but anybody who values life in Hawaii, these places are going to be impacted. You know, I work for the National Park Service, so many of our coastal parks, Pu'uhonua, Honaunau, Kaloko Honokohau, they're all along the coastline. Right. So it raises the question, what are we going to do, not only at the National Park Service, but as Native Hawaiians or as a community in Kona, to address or think about what's going to happen when these sites aren't there? What stories are we going to tell? What new stories can we tell? How can we help preserve the legacy of these places, even though the physical structure may not be there? So, interesting challenges.
And attempts by Hawaiians to rebuild traditional agriculture, for example. A young man I know is working very hard on developing lo'i over in Kaneohe, in a very low area. Yep. That's endangered.
It's, I would, well, it,
by saltwater intrusion?
It depends how close to the coast. You might be referring to Heia, you know, where some of the as you get closer to the coast, sea level rise may be impacting some of the lo'i kalo there, and they've thought about that potential, and so they're looking at, well, as sea level rises and they can't grow kalo there, they may shift to another crop, or they may change it so that it can better absorb storm floods or what have you, and shift their agricultural practice more inland, more upland, and continue on. So that's a good case study, I guess, in thinking about adaptation and future changes.
Jaron wants to know, what is our economic incentive to take these steps that Mr. Aila is talking about? There doesn't seem to be any immediate return on investment. Somebody else before this program asked me that question. He says, you got to get somehow you got to get business and capital interested in climate change. You've got to get them interested in adaptation and mitigation. If you don't, it's pie in the sky. It's people on a Thursday night on a PBS station talking about it. What do you think?
Yeah, the incentive is, the cost of water is going to go up significantly if we don't do this right now. The cost to mitigate shoreline damage, coral damage, sedimentation damage is going to be borne by taxpayers. I mean, we can invest a little bit now to avoid a big payment at the end of this process.
Paula wants to know, can we reverse climate change if we stop polluting, or is it too late to completely stop it?
Unfortunately, they have shown that if we were to hold off on our carbon emissions today, stop them, it would still, the temperature, the global temperature would still continue to rise for a couple more years, although it would be much slowed. And of course, that's not a very realistic thing to do in the end anyway, to cut all emissions. But what we do have a choice in is we have scenarios in the future of how we choose to live as a world, as a society, you know, a high emission future, or a more conservative green future. And so we can see on these models how much temperature rise we can expect in the next 100 years, depending on what kind of development we take as a nation and as the Earth.
Johnny at the university, global warming is caused by the growth of the human population. We will not be able to control global warming unless we control population growth. Boy, if there, you know, we talk about a lot of things around this table and, over the years, and so many of them come back, it seems to me, to exactly that point.
There's an awful lot of truth to that.
Population. But how do scientists and how do people? How do you talk to somebody about people who come to your table about population?
Well, it's a tough issue. I mean, from a policy perspective, people don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Yeah, the implications are staggering. But I don't disagree with that perspective. As population increases, the potential to impact our environment on a global scale is there. Again, I think it comes back to countries, governments, communities to not think so much about controlling population, but thinking about what uses, what activities that population undertakes. Maybe there are ways in which, instead of being so consumer-driven, so carbon-intensive, that we can simplify some of our lifestyles, that we can accommodate a greater population. But yeah, it's a tough issue.
And also educating the population and giving women access to good health services has been very effective in controlling family size, just giving people more options with what they do with their own bodies.
Yeah, but then politics can get involved too, as we well know. This is your chance, Chip. Here it is. Chan wants to know, what areas of Oahu would be affected by rising sea levels? Any well-known areas? Come on, lay it on.
The western portion of Waikiki, over by the yacht harbor, Ala Moana Boulevard. These are the golf course on the Mauka side of the Alawai Canal. These are all areas that are vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise. 1 foot of sea level rise is going to hit roadways and intersections at high tide in certain areas. 1 foot of sea level rise could potentially cause coastal erosion on the order of 100 feet of erosion. There's just a basic rule of thumb of a 1 to 100 ratio between sea level rise and the retreat of the coastline. That falls apart, though, in areas where you have a lot of sand availability. But many of our beaches are already deficient in sand because we've wiped out the native sand dunes that used to be throughout Hawaii, and instead we've planted our yards and our walkways on them. That's sort of the bank account, the savings account of sand for beaches, and that's gone. So beaches are sand deficient in many areas, and when sea level rise continues to cause them to erode, they're going to erode quite dramatically.
What happens to our someone wants to know what happens to our harbors. Would Honolulu Harbor and Pearl Harbor still be usable with, say, a rise of a foot or two?
Yeah, it's going to take a significant amount of money to retrofit, but yeah, they would still be usable.
They wouldn't be swamped out or
There might be more wave energy into some of the harbors, but we can adapt.
I think it is short-sighted, Rita in Kailua Kona says, to only speak of our children and grandchildren. Climate problems will go on forevermore. Is it fair to ask developing countries, as often asked, to cut down on greenhouse gases? America has already had our chance to pollute like crazy, and we build our country. Karen wants to know.
It's not fair.
It's not fair.
It's not fair. But
So we got ours.
It has to be done.
So we're talking the imbalances between places like industrializing third world countries and rural areas, I suppose, of China or India or any.
That's why there's no agreement at these United Nations climate conferences that take place. You know, India, they're finally rising up to the level of a fully developed nation, and they don't want to put the brakes on their economy in order to counteract climate change. And they point to the U.S. and say, you got yours, why can't we get ours?
Two people want to know, Jackie and Tom want to know, why are there still climate change doubters? I mean, you say the science is overwhelming, 1,300 scientific studies, 24 people say no. But why are there still doubters?
I would, well, sometimes you just can't change people's minds. I mean, think about, maybe this is a bad analogy, but think about all of the dangers with smoking and all of the lawsuits and all of the science and everything that says smoking is bad, but people still continue to smoke. So again, it comes back to a certain belief that they have that they can smoke and maybe they won't get sick. In this case, yeah, despite all of this reasonable science, they don't want to accept it. They, for whatever reason, for their lifestyle or what have you. Sometimes people just can't change their mind.
Fundamentally, it's asking people to change the way that they live, which nobody wants to think about. And when you compare it to past environmental crises like the hole in the ozone that was so well resolved, when it comes to stopping using an aerosol can or stopping driving a car, those are very different sacrifices that you're asking people to make.
Bill, I stood behind a guy in a 7-Eleven store the other day, and he bought a pack of cigarettes. I hadn't seen a pack of cigarettes bought in a while, and the lady charged her $10.40. Then I looked it up on the internet, and I found out $3 of that goes to the state of Hawaii in taxes on a package of cigarettes. $3. Why can't we tax people out of bad habits that contribute to climate change? Don't we have the guts to do that? What about that boss of yours? You got to talk to that boss of yours.
My boss is out there doing that right now, especially with the soda tax. So he's trying. We need some help from our legislators to buy into the process that we're all responsible for our actions, and we all have to chip in to solve the problem.
I think it's appropriate to tax behavior that threatens your community. And I think a tax, like a barrel tax or a carbon tax, I think it's a very appropriate thing to do. And because that gets into the economics and it gets into lifestyle choices, that's why there are still people who refuse to accept the science of climate change. The science is the easy part. It's lifestyle choices that and personal economics that get very difficult.
Yeah. Could we tax water use? Could we well, we do tax water use, don't we? Now that I think about it, I don't pay that bill at home. We do tax that, and the barrel tax, of course. And yeah, well, okay. What have each of the panelists done in their personal lifestyle to help mitigate climate change? Peter on the North Shore, come on. Let's hear it. Aila, you biking in from Waianae every day?
It's a little too far, but I don't drive when I don't need to. That's one way. I make sure that when I water the plants at home, I put the minimum amount. I mulch extra heavily. I try to grow as much as my own food as possible to reduce energy costs. So we're taking steps at home.
Stanton?
A number of things. Like William, if I don't have to go in, I don't drive. I catch the bus into work. I put my bike on the bus and I ride home from downtown to Hawaii Kai 4 days a week. So not only do I get my exercise, but I'm helping the planet and, yeah, improving my own health along the way.
You young guys can do so many things like that. Jeff?
I commute with my family in a Prius. I stopped using shopping bags a long time ago. And as soon as I get away from having to drive my kids to school, my wife and I plan on using the bus to go to work. I try and make cuts wherever possible, and I generally feel like I'm not doing enough.
Victoria?
I ride my bike to work every single day. I also don't use plastic grocery bags. I must have had an influence on my husband because now he takes army showers, turns off the shower, soaps up, and, and turns it back on to rinse off. So.
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that I'm an old guy who doesn't do much to mitigate.
this seems so important. Are the guests involved in trying to establish a policy in the elementary schools so that people will be more involved in the future? They say if you're going to change a culture, you got to get to the kids, right? We're talking to a demographic that's kind of old tonight. This is not a kids demographic watching this show. Are we doing that?
Probably not as much as we should if we are. I think that's an excellent point. It does start with our kids. And maybe that's something that Department of Education needs to be brought into the discussion and having a more in-depth conversation around their science curriculum development. I would certainly support that. My kids go to public school, and yeah, I would certainly love to see that happen.
We need to do it, yeah? More than we am?
Yes, we need to do it more than we are, and public education is the foundation for change. I'm part of a grant from the National Science Foundation where we are doing a lot of teacher training, not only in Hawaii, but throughout the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. And we hold workshops in American Samoa and Palau. And when you train the teachers, they can then train their colleagues and take it down into the classroom.
Got to go. Thanks very much. We haven't had this much smarts around this table in a long time. We've had a lot of controversy, but not this many smarts. And I thank you all for being here. And best of luck in your work. It's important stuff. Next week, we'll be taking the week off from Insights for a special pledge program featuring the brothers Casimiro. So bring your checkbooks next week. We won't be here, but bring your checkbook. The following week, we'll explore another of President Obama and Governor Abercrombie's top priorities, early education. What are the benefits to our children and to society at large when all students start school before kindergarten and learn about global warming? We'll speak with the governor's top expert on this issue, as well as educators, advocates, parents, and the State Senate Education Chair. That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. A hui home.